The Farmington Canal was busy in our area from 1828 to 1848. The long level section, which was Plainville, was the single most important factor in the growth of the Great Plain area of Farmington into Plainville. Now, 164 years later, let's look at how that canal affected the history of Plainville. The canal came in to Plainville on Town Line Road, in the Town Line Road area, and headed in a northerly direction. Almost immediately we have a farm crossover bridge, where this farmer had to have access to both parts of his farm. From this point we go northerly to the land of Ira Hooker. Hooker was one of our many tinsmiths who did their tinning up on Redstone Hill, which would appear here on the left of your canal. And he needed access to the land that is presently Norton Park, which is where he dumped all his clippings. You can still find tin clippings down in there, as you can in the driveways and land up on Redstone Hill of many of the old houses up there. Plainville was a major tin center at this time, you know. Now we're going to start bending around to the east, and we're coming over to South Washington Street. And at South Washington Street, near the entrance of Norton Park, there was another bridge. This would have been a traffic-bearing bridge, but we know very little about it except that it appears on the maps. Now, again, in a northeasterly direction, we're heading on up to Broad Street at Canal Street. This was a major center, a large bridge, a traffic-bearing bridge, and a major center of activity during canal days. During canal days, we have to remember that there was no photography. The pictures that we use to represent various vignettes of canal history on our own canal are sometimes lifted from other canals, sometimes they're drawings, sometimes they're woodcuts, steel engravings. These all represent different phases of our canal history. I like to think that this one represents the canal at Broad Street and Canal Street, and the canal at this point is heading north. These boys are on their way to Old Broad Street School, and they're going to be tardy, and they're really going to catch it. You see one has his lunch in his hand there. Now, there's something very exciting going on under that bridge, and of course the canal is going under that bridge. Probably it's a boatload of something interesting like carriages headed for New Haven. In New Haven, they'll be offloaded onto ocean-going vessels and taken down to the southern states, which was our largest customer for our carriages. From here, 100 boats a week cleared up and down in Plainville. And from here the canal continues on up to Bristol Basin. Continuing on up from the busy Broad Street Bridge, we go through some back lots and across a couple side dirt streets and arrive at Bristol Basin. Bristol Basin was an amazing place. The horses would pull the boats in. There'd be a great deal of confusion as people disembarked, new passengers got on. Merchandise was taken off, put in the store. Dogs barked, mules brayed. Generally a place of tremendous activity. And why is it Bristol Basin? Why isn't it Plainville Center or Plainville Basin? Because of the Bristol clockmakers. The Bristol clockmakers were very influential in getting Bristol Basin built exactly where it was. It was a close point for them from Bristol to cart down their clockware, put it on the smooth riding canal boats, and off would go the merchandise to market, unscathed by a ride over a long and bumpy turnpike journey, which was tremendously detrimental to their stock. So Bristol Basin, because of Bristol clocks coming into Plainville, good money there, good money invested in the canal. And here in the center we have two major mercantiles side by side across the canal. We have the H.M. Welch, which is one we don't hear a lot about. He also had a canal boat. And across the canal from him was Adna Whiting. We know that Adna's store stood on the east bank of the canal. And Adna also had a canal boat, and they were always racing those boats. There was a great deal of competition, friendly, we assume. And so Bristol Basin was a tremendously busy place back in canal days, and we have an excellent picture of it. In the doorway of the general store, we see Adna Whiting, the proud Plainville proprietor of this mercantile. Adna was a canny old Yankee merchant, and during one particularly bad winter when the drifts were extremely deep and the canal, of course, was frozen over, he had an intuition that it was going to be a bad winter, and he really stocked up on barrels of flour. And oh, did he gouge the Plainvillites. He really got a high price for that flour, and of course people were desperate, they paid for it. I wonder what their attitude was towards Adna when the weather cleared. The series has just pulled in there. They have unhitched the mules and taken them away for well-deserved rest. And they're going to open up the holes of that little boat pretty soon, and they're going to unload merchandise for Adna. How do we know? Maybe that's his flour coming in. The series was built in Plainville. One of two boats that we know. The other was the Enterprise that was built in Plainville. At this point, the canal is heading due north, and that's West Main Street crossing on the bridge. And there is a historical, technically wrong bit of business there. That should not be brick. It should be rough stone, rough red stone. The Paragon was a packet ship that ran between New Haven and the Massachusetts line. It was a very fast ship and was supposed to serve very good food. The center of Plainville was an extremely busy place. Lots of noise when the boats would come in. Lots of busyness that you don't see in this particular painting. That gentleman way down in the corner must be waiting for his boat. Plainville Center was a busy, busy place and one of the major ports on the canal. Actually, it was the port of Plainville. Leaving the center of Plainville, we arrive at a location approximately where the Plainville Public Library is today, and here's another one of those farm crossover bridges where a farmer had to have access to both sides of his land, and so the canal company built him a bridge. Those bridges cost about $70 to build in those days. They were wooden. Now we're going to move on over towards Farmington Avenue, and we come to the location of the dry dock, which is in back of the present-day bank. The dry dock was a place where boats were repaired. Two of our boats were built there, and it was a very busy place with the water running out of the dry dock out into the Pequabic Marsh out in this area. They had a gate that you could pull the water out more or less so the men didn't have to stand and waist deep water. This little appendage on the canal is for a major clock factory, a Plainville clock factory, not to be confused with the Bristol clockmakers that we talked about. Then we go on to Whiting's Basin. Whiting's Basin was a large basin where the Plainville Wayside Furniture Store is today. And the Plainville Wayside Furniture Store was a hotel in canal days. Here is where Adna Whiting first started into business, and it was not a good location, and Adna felt that in his bones. He was pretty smart. He sold this to two gentlemen from Farmington, and I want to say two Farmington suckers, but that's not nice, so we'll say less enterprising gentlemen, who went broke. Adna moved over into the center of Plainville to Bristol Basin and made a fortune for himself. Right in here was a horse stop, where they had stables where the horses were renewed. Every 10 miles you had to change your horses, and this was done on a basis of working for the canal company. They advertised for people to do this, and you supplied the horses and they paid you. Then we go over beyond the basin here where there was a large lumber yard, which was a very successful enterprise for a long, long time. And then from this point on, it's a long, lonesome stretch up into Farmington. The specifications for the Farmington Canal were the specifications for a fairly small canal. It was only 4 feet deep. It was 36 feet wide at the top, 20 feet wide at the bottom. Over on the side we had a 10-foot wide towpath on which the horses trod. Now the horses went both back and forth on the towpath. And many people ask, well, how did the boats pass? The boat going upstream or towards the Massachusetts line always had the right of way. In order for that boat to get by a boat going downstream, the downstream boat slowed down, stopped, dropped his tow line to the bottom of the canal, and the upstream boat simply ran over his tow line. There's wild stories from other canals about knives being mounted on front of boats and cutting tow lines when they weren't allowed the right of passage. But I don't think our Farmington Canal got into those things. Over on the berm bank, over on the other side of this tremendously wide canal, was the berm bank, and this was the work bank. And you might see a man going along that with little bundles of straw stuffed in all his pockets. And he would use these to stick them in the muskrat holes, because a muskrat hole in time of high water could become a terrific washout very, very quickly. The equipment used for digging the Farmington Canal was extremely primitive. The largest piece of equipment used was a horse and a dump cart. This, along with spades, shovels of various kinds, wheelbarrows, were the major tools used in digging this 58 miles of canal Remember, we saw that it was 36 feet wide, 20 feet wide at the bottom. That's a lot of soil and a lot of stone to be moved. There were a lot of tired Irishmen and a lot of herniated horses by the time that canal was built. The canal was built from New Haven, from Tidewater in New Haven, all the way through to the Massachusetts border at the Congamon Pond area. There were locks on this canal. There were no locks in Plainville. The locks raised and lowered boats, and as you know, were very level. So we were part of the long, level part of the canal, which ran from Southington to Granby. And there were a total of 28 locks on the canal, raising the canal 220 feet above sea level. The men and the horses worked for very reasonable wages and very primitive working conditions. They lived in kind of labor camps along the canal. And if you've ever used your wheelbarrow to do a little project at home and moved a wheelbarrow full of earth and dumped it in a little hole on your lawn, I'm sure you stood there thinking, wow, that didn't go very far. Imagine facing 58 miles of canal to dig. The Irishmen that came to work on the canal had, many of them, previously worked on the Erie Canal and followed the engineers over here. They had left their homeland in a very bad time in their history. They were coming up on the potato famine, and people were having an extremely bad time in Ireland. They came here to work for 40 cents a day plus a ration of grog. And they were the subject of a great deal of prejudice. Even here in the Great Plains in Plainville, there were signs that said Irish need not apply, Irish do not attend. But history has looked very fondly and kindly on these Irish workers. They were good, honest, strong-backed people, and many of them stayed and became good citizens. And in our old land deeds on record in the town hall, you will find many of the pieces of land along the canal were purchased and built on by these Irish laborers. Horsepower is a very important segment of the history of the canal, which we'll look at in detail. And the little horse-drawn scoop over on the left-hand side of the painting was another implement of moving the soil. And it certainly didn't carry very much soil. And here, this could either be a road construction or canal construction, but for our purposes, we're saying it's canal construction. When the engineers came over from New York from building the Erie Canal, they didn't realize we had very, very different soil here in Connecticut. Therefore, in many of the sandy sections, when the water was let into the canal, it went right out the bottom of the canal. And this caused great agitation among the population. There was no money in the specs for additional work, and so the townspeople were called on to what they called puddle the canal. Puddling simply meant that you got in with your bare feet and you tamped in a big layer of clay. Now, in our town of Plainville, our clay is red. If you've been up Redstone Hill, you know that the clay up there is from red stone. And when Mr. Holden, our marvelous artist, painted this watercolor for us, he did not realize we had red clay in Plainville. So it's a standing historical joke at the museum that we have changed the color of our clay. However, in the foreground of this picture, you'll see the Plainville folk making merry with their tamping down of the clay. And again, the little wheelbarrows are at work. And in the background, to the left, you see our little dump cart, which appears again and again in the history of the canal, dumping a load of clay there, and the men are wheeling it away in the wheelbarrow. Down in the front are a couple of well-dressed gentlemen who no doubt are the supervisors from the canal. And they're saying, my, aren't the Plainville folk doing a good job? Now, over on the back bank, you can see that the Plainville folk not only did a good job, but they also had a good time. And they're setting up a fantastic lunch there for the workers, and they're going to have a party. Our puddling was extremely successful. They put in a layer of clay that was a foot thick. And when we did our restoration of the Farmington Canal in Norton Park in 1970, we hit that layer of clay, and it's as solid and firm today as it was when it was put in approximately 1828. We ran bulldozers over it, and we ran some of the Tomaso's huge dump trucks over it, and it never gave. So good for Plainville puddling. Little dump carts that we keep showing you in these canal pictures. And this is a toy made of iron and made of tin, given to us by Dorothy Getchell, part of her family's treasure trove. And it shows very well how this little dump cart worked. They would, of course, load the material in, and then to dump it, they dumped it like that. So there you are, actual working model of a piece of equipment from Farmington Canal days.
Canal days. Some of these horses lived lives of shattering labor and poor care. Others, luckier in their owners, were cared for as the valuable walking stock they were. Humane societies and social awareness of animal needs were still decades away, and the animals received as little or as much care as the owners saw fit. Horses were changed every 10 miles, and the supplying of these beasts was done on a contract basis with the canal company. This is Ivan Wood and Bert Norton with Bucky and Teddy, who received much, much better care than the canal horses ever did.
How's that?
And galls were a very big problem on these canal horses. Their work was all one-sided, and even with special whiffle trees, the horses developed sores. There were magical cures and marvelous potions put on the market, but I don't think many of them helped the horses. Common sense probably helped them more. Captain Humphrey, the Simsbury boat captain, who also rebuilt the aqueduct in the 1830s, had a notebook, and we have a copy of that notebook. In that notebook, he relates that he paid $1.25 for a tow line, a long tow line, at the Welch store in the center of Bristol Basin. He also paid 78 cents to have his horses shod, 25 cents for a single shoe. So you see, the horses were terribly important in our canal days. And I think horses just don't get their credit in history. Okay.
For the horses was a major problem. The bridges were built very, very steeply. You could just faintly see a load of hay, and there's an ox pulling it. And one of the things you asked during canal days was, does the beast crowd at the bridge before you bought a horse, a mule, or an ox? If he crowded at the bridge, that meant he put up a big fight to pull this load up over the steep incline, and you would never purchase a beast like this. And you'll notice here the very, very little bit of clearance that these boats had going under a typical farm bridge. These farm bridges were built to keep the price down, and they, as the history of the canal progressed, they got narrower and narrower and lower and lower. And to come under a bridge, the captain would yell, "Low bridge, everybody down." And one lady who was riding on one of these bridges from Southington lost part of her ear on the top of the bridge. I don't know what position her body was in to lose part of her ear, but nevertheless she did. Now the boats were tied on a third of the way down, not on the front of the boat, because that would have pulled the nose into the bank and you would have had a constant problem. But a third of the way down kept the boats on a good course. And they had a long, long tow line, which we know cost $1.25, because we have a record of one being bought in Bristol Basin in the center of Plainville. This went over to the horse and or a mule, the term being interchangeable in canal days. And here we have a mule and a horse. And the horses also might come in threes, depending on the load, how big the boat was. The man who took care of the horses, man or the boy, was called a hoggie, which is a Dutch word, and we don't really know much about it. He might ride one of the horses and or mules, or he might walk beside them, but he was in control of the horses. This picture might very well be Town Line Road Bridge in Plainville, Connecticut, back in the 1820s, 1830s, during canal days. And here we're coming up the canal, we're headed towards the center of Plainville. Coming in from the south, from the Town Line Road Bridge area, up into the center of town, we see the cows are contentedly grazing right in the center, but there's also a lot of activity there. We have a little farm boat here, the little blue boat, which has come in perhaps from Farmington with a tremendous load of potatoes on it. The farmers use these little clunky boats to bring in their harvest to Adna Whiting, who acted as a middleman between the farmers and the public. These little boats would often be on the bottom of the canal when the farmer wanted to use them, but since it was only 4 feet deep, it was no major problem, and he'd go out and he'd take the water out, throw the potatoes in, and go on over to Adna's store.
And we haul and we curse and we swear, unload the cargo and then prepare to store the liquor off and smoke. Down tall tales, swat lies and joke.
And then we go over to the next boat, which is parked or moored in front of Adna Whiting's store. And this is one of the large freighter boats. This would have carried and been about the same size as a modern day trailer truck. In this we might have seen shingles, we might have seen copper ore coming down out of the Bristol area, we might have seen clocks, tinware, we might have seen some of Plainville's carriages that we were so famous for back in the 1820s through 40s. The carriages were taken down the canal, down to New Haven, and offloaded onto sailing ships and taken to the southern states. In order to get that boat in that position, we had to have the horses pull it up the towpath from Southington, towpath being shown here on the left, and then the horses would cross over the West Main Street Bridge. That's where the canal went, under the West Main Street Bridge. The horses would then walk back towards Adna's store and be in a position to renegotiate starting the boats up again when the cargo had been undone. The activity in the center was tremendous. There would be children running, there would be dogs barking, people getting on the boats, people getting off the boats, cargo being moved around. You had to watch your toes in Bristol Basin, center of Plainville, in the 1820s through 40s.
Oh, Captain Dick is a fine old bird. Yes, he is, upon my word. When he's got both his teeth, so he's got no excuse for his whiskers to be filled with tobacco juice.
And of course, Captain Dick Norton was one of our canal boat captains. He was captain of the series, which was built in Plainville, belonged to Adna Whiting. Went back and forth all the way from New Haven to Northampton 2 or 3 times a week, and always got in around 4 o'clock, as the song tells us. After the canal went belly up, Captain Dick became a 49er and went out to the gold rush and didn't make any more money there than he did on the canal. Adna Whiting's store was a very, very influential place in the center of our town. Adna had originally started over on Farmington Avenue at what was called Whiting's Basin. But he soon learned that that was not the spot of activity, even though the stagecoaches came in there, crossed with the canal traffic. There was not enough business there, and he finally sold that out to a couple of fellows from Farmington who were perhaps not as bright as they should have been to buy it. Adna moved over into the center of town, and the center of town just blossomed around him. And this is why the center of Plainville is where it is. The Bristol clockmakers put up a good deal of the money because they wanted to bring their clocks down and ship them out by canal boat, and that's why it was called Bristol Basin, although it was Plainville, Connecticut.
2 to 3 times a week, about 4 o'clock. Out comes Annie and old F2, come Homer, Bella, and the rest of the crew. And it's work all day and play all night.
And that's where our story will be commenced in a second. Every building in the center of Plainville was extremely important during canal days because we were a very small area. We still aren't very big, but we were very small then. And these buildings have been extremely well researched by both our town clerk and myself. We know exactly where these buildings stood. And the 2 that you're looking at now were dwellings, and one little building was extremely important in the history of our town. The tavern that sat alongside the canal in canal days was a place of social gatherings for the men. I don't believe that it was a drunkenness place, as we might think of an old tavern. The records that we find was that it was more of a social gathering. The men went there to relax, the drovers, the drivers, the men about town, the farmers possibly, and they would stop in for a sociable evening with their friends. And of course, on the end of the tavern there was a little shed for their horses. And any place where men or women gathered in those days, there had to be some sort of shelter for the horses because people did care for their animals. And they weren't left standing out, as you see the cowboys' horses sometimes in the westerns, in the sleet and the rain. Mostly the horses were cared for. From the tavern, we go over to another section of town that was created as an inland wetland when the canal leaked, and the canal did leak extensively. And this is another place of social gathering, but it's for the piggies of the town. And of course, where the pigs have a wallow, there's always a good deal of mud and dead trees. But this is typical of what you would have found in a small town. The animals did graze and wander around pretty much at will. And it wasn't until many, many years later when you had to restrict your animals. We'll go back and we'll cross over the bridge that stood about where the library is now on East Main Street. And this bridge was built to keep a farmer having access, allowing the farmer to have access to both sides of his farm when the canal went through. And over on this other bank you see the cows grazing. And the trees are growing nicely because, again, there's a good supply of water. And in this area was our dry dock, where boats were built and boats were repaired. And you see a little farm boat up on the ways, and there would have been a gate there. And beyond the gate, you could draw the water off. The water would have gone off into the Quabox marsh and left you a more or less dry place to stand and work on your boat. There was a little lumber shed there to protect the lumber that you were using on the boat, and it was a general work area. We know that our series, the canal boat series, was built there. Also, the Enterprise was built there, and many, many boats were repaired there.
Webster never went to school, but he sure can learn any on the radio. He chose tobacco, and by God, he drinks rum, but he sure make this old canal boat come.
The canal boats were divided into three sections, as we've seen, three types of boats. We've seen the farm boat, we've seen the freighter, and now this is the Greyhound of the waterway. This is our packet boat. Packet boats were highly painted, highly colored, and for some strange reason they all had red curtains. We don't know why. These boats went so fast and kicked up such a wake in back of them that they started to break down the banks of the canal. And so the canal company passed a 4-mile-an-hour speed limit on these Greyhounds of the canal. These packet boats were really marvelous. They served very good food, and it cost $3.75 to run the whole length of the canal, which could be an overnight trip when the canal first opened. This was a very popular honeymoon trip. A farmer might take his new bride on this luxurious cruise, as we would think of it today. Good food, she didn't have to do any work for a whole overnight. Then he took her home and he retied her to the kitchen stove, and she was there for the rest of her life. The boats were very sleek and did make good speed. The horses were changed every 10 miles, and they were a lighter weight horse than were used on the on the freighters. And you remember how we were saying that the term horse or a mule could be interchangeable. On the packet boats, it was mostly horses, and they were changed every 10 miles at what we call horse stops. And we did have a horse stop in Plainville. It stood over by where the Plainville Wayside Furniture Store is now, where there was Blossom's Tavern in canal days, and that was a logical place to change the horses. And you know, I think we may have a problem here. I think I hear a canal boat coming, and how are we going to pass two canal boats on this little narrow canal with one towpath? Well, we do have another boat here to contend with, and this is the way passing on the canal was handled. Whatever boat was going upstream, in other words north, or if it was a packet, it had the right of way. The boat going south on the canal, or if it was a freighter, had to give way to the packet or the upstream going boat. And the way they did this is the boat going south had to drop its tow line. Its horses walked to the outside or the inside to us of the towpath. And the other horses pulling the packet or pulling the northbound boat would simply pass over the tow line, and the boat would be pulled across the tow line, and everyone would proceed happily on their way. We visited the center of Plainville during the canal days. We've seen the kinds of bridges, we've seen the kinds of boats, and 2 different kinds of horses. And our packets, of course, are fast boats running off into history. And now we are over beyond the East Main Street Bridge. We've gone beyond the horse changing station, beyond the dry dock. And there goes our canal boat. There goes our packet on into history, on the long, lonesome route to Farmington.
Work all day and play all night, start all over and it's getting daylight.
If I live till I die there, well then that'd be all right. The people of the canal painted one of the most interesting chapters in all canal history. In canal days, early on in canal days, the Sabbath was kept very strictly. No boats moved, no horses worked. People were supposed to eat cold meals because not even any cooking was supposed to have been carried on. Some of the canal people kept to themselves on their boats rather than being out with the village people, and this was especially true with the Irish folk who, as we have seen, were not particularly accepted by the townsfolk. So here we have Sabbath on the canal, a lovely illustration from a Harper's Bazaar of that era. And we see the family playing with the children. There would have been no time for that during the week. Everybody worked. The children worked, the adults worked, the horses worked during the week. It was a rough life. Home life aboard a canal boat was a very restricted type of living. The boats, as you remember, were long and narrow and very small cabins. Mother has a dry sink up front, and we certainly hope that she is not using canal water in that big bucket. She has a kerosene lamp, which would have been a fire hazard aboard a boat, and tiny little sleeping quarters off to the left with a door that could close them off during the daytime. We also see clothes hanging up over the bunks. Sometimes 8 to 10 people lived on these boats, which seems amazing. And I've been told, or I have read, that during a wet period, when you had a week or so of rain, they became very damp and mildewy, and everything below deck was very wet to the touch. Mother's probably peeling potatoes, and very shortly Dad will tie up the boat along the canal somewhere, take the mules or horses off and give them their feed bags, wipe them down for the night, and he'll come on for his meal. Wash day on the canal must have been a circus. The lady over on the right is scrubbing clothes in a bucket. Again, let's hope she's not using canal water with all its contaminants. You see, there were no sanitary facilities on these boats, and everything early on in canal history was just dumped right into the canal. That's a back-breaking job that she has, scrubbing the clothes, and the lady to the left is hanging them out. And they'll probably have to be taken down 20 to 25 times in the course of drying. And the reason for this is because the bridges were built so low over the canal to conserve money that when the boats went under, there was no extra room, and Dad at the helm would be yelling, "Low bridge, low bridge, everybody down." And that meant Mom and her laundry, and I think it must have been a very frustrating day of the week. Captain Andrew Dick Norton was captain of the Ceres, the boat that was owned by Adna Whiting. And he had quite an adventurous life. Not only was he captain of a boat on the raging canal, surviving storms, droughts, and whatever, but after the canal died in 1849, he went west with the 49ers to the California gold fields. We know where Captain Dick's house is on Washington Street. We also know that he came back without a fortune from the gold fields. Poor Captain Dick. This painting by Hepworth of William Homer is very important to canal history because his forebear, Governor Homer, or Gov Homer as he was called, was one of the people that was important on the canal. He worked for Adna Whiting. He worked on a boat. He was a regular person in the center of town, showing that black people were gainfully employed and important to their jobs in canal days. The people of the canal, I think, have painted a very interesting picture of canal days.
And back of St. Joseph's Cemetery where the trees are a pretty good size, and you can still see the very definite outline of the towpath. You can imagine a horse walking, plodding along, pulling a canal boat. Listen to that harness creaking and listen to that water sloshing. Let's hop on and take a ride along the towpath there. Through the trees. The trees wouldn't have even been there in 1830. Here you can also see the depth of the canal. It's quite well defined down in here. Not a lot of water, but the basin or the banks of the canal are still good and firm. The towpath is defined, and it's a lovely walk on a Sunday. Go down all the way back in St. Joseph's Cemetery and then walk to your right. Follow through to Northampton Lane. It's a nice little piece of the canal. Off Farmington Avenue, the site of Whiting's Basin during canal days, we have Old Canal Square, a fairly new development. And oxen left the imprint of their hooves on history. So did the steel railroad rails leave an imprint on history. The railroad company, of course, is going out of business. The canal line no longer exists to any intents and purposes. We were at one time a crossroads of stagecoach and canal travel. Then we became a crossroads of two major railroads. Now we're a crossroad of two major superhighways. What does the future hold for us as far as transportation goes? We're always a transportation hub. And although our canal has faded from view, the railroad taking over when the canal company became a railroad company, our canal will never be out of our memory as long as history books last and as long as, hopefully, our video cassette lasts. Our canal, the full length of Connecticut, has been accepted to be on the National Registry of Historic Places, which will further perpetuate its historical memory.